Imagine this: a philosopher who believed that life itself was a mistake, that happiness was a fleeting illusion, and that the only real truth was suffering. Now imagine that same man turning his gaze, not toward war, politics, or religion, but toward women. What he wrote wasn't just controversial, it was brutal, merciless, and, to some, unforgivable. Arthur Schopenhauer, the godfather of philosophical pessimism, didn't just criticize women. He dismantled them in ink with surgical coldness. His words weren't cloaked in subtlety or diplomacy. They were raw, unfiltered, and venomous. In his infamous essay, On Women, Schopenhauer unleashed what might be the most unapologetic philosophical attack on femininity ever penned by a respected thinker. He accused women of being vain, manipulative, intellectually inferior, and nothing more than vessels of reproduction. And he didn't stop there. He suggested their very existence was tied to the perpetuation of human misery itself. But why? Why would a man known for profound metaphysical insights descend into such bitter misogyny? Was this the result of pure logic gone rogue? A wounded ego lashing out in philosophical form? Or was there something deeper, something darker beneath the surface? This isn't a defense of Schopenhauer. It's not a takedown either. This is an unflinching journey into one of the cruelest corners of Western philosophy, a confrontation with genius and hatred in the same breath. Because behind his scorn lies a worldview that challenges the very foundations of progress, equality, and even hope itself. In this exploration, we'll trace the roots of his rage, dissect the ideas that shaped his worldview, and ask the hardest question of all: can brilliance coexist with deep prejudice, or are they sometimes born from the same abyss? Welcome to the mind of Schopenhauer. Enter at your own risk. Arthur Schopenhauer didn't just question the meaning of life, he denied it. He believed existence itself was a mistake, an error in the cosmic ledger that should never have occurred. Unlike the Enlightenment thinkers, who glorified reason, progress, and human potential, Schopenhauer stared into the heart of reality and saw only pain, futility, and endless craving. He called this hidden engine behind all life the will, a blind, insatiable force that drives every creature to survive, to desire, and to suffer. We aren't thinking beings guided by purpose, he argued. We're puppets of this will, chasing illusions of happiness that vanish the moment we reach them. Life is suffering, not because of some moral failing or political flaw, but because suffering is baked into the very structure of existence. The moment we are born, the will takes hold, dragging us through a life of longing, frustration, and momentary relief that quickly fades into boredom or despair. Even love, which we romanticize and celebrate, is for Schopenhauer nothing more than the will's tactic to trick us into reproduction, to prolong a cycle of suffering for the next generation. This wasn't a man searching for hope. It was a man peeling back the curtain and demanding we look at the machinery behind the theater. His worldview was one of radical disillusionment, and his philosophy reflected it in every direction. He didn't see humanity as noble or enlightened. He saw us as animals in denial, dressing up primal urges in polite words and moral ideals. And it's from this metaphysical gloom, from this belief that all life is driven by torment and illusion, that his most vicious ideas about women begin to take shape, not as separate opinions, but as consequences of the same pitiless logic. In 1851, Arthur Schopenhauer published a short essay that would echo through the centuries, not for its insight, but for its cruelty, titled simply, On women, it wasn't a philosophical argument so much as a declaration of contempt. In it, he didn't critique women. He reduced them. He described them as childish, short-sighted, and driven purely by instinct. He claimed their reasoning was inferior, their passions shallow, their ambitions limited to vanity and manipulation. For Schopenhauer, woman was not the equal of man. She was a biological necessity, a vessel of reproduction, and once that purpose was fulfilled, he believed she rapidly lost her value. This wasn't veiled language. It wasn't subtle. It was venom. He wrote that women possess no real sense of justice, that they are meant to obey, and that their natural state is one of dependence. Even their beauty, he argued, was nature's bait, an evolutionary trick to lure men into the trap of fatherhood. He didn't just attack the institution of marriage, he mocked it, calling it a financial transaction where men are duped into servitude by their own desire. And yet this wasn't satire. This was dead serious. Schopenhauer believed that women, by their very nature, were representatives of the will to life, meaning they embodied everything he sought to escape: reproduction, desire, illusion. In his eyes, women weren't just flawed. They were the embodiment of the very force that cursed humanity in the first place. It was a worldview not just steeped in misogyny, but metaphysical loathing, a hatred not only of women, but of life itself, projected onto the female form. On women wasn't just a personal rant. It was the natural consequence of a man who believed that to live was to suffer, and that women were the gatekeepers of that suffering. Behind every philosopher's pen is a person, a childhood, a set of wounds, a tangle of unresolved emotion. And Arthur Schopenhauer's venom toward women didn't begin in abstract thought. It began at home. His mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, was everything he despised: successful, sociable, admired by the cultural elite. She was a celebrated writer, a salon hostess, a woman who thrived in the very world Arthur rejected. Their relationship was more than strained. It was a cold war of intellect and ego. He accused her of being superficial. She saw him as bitter and arrogant. When he moved out of her house, he didn't just leave. It was a rupture that never healed. She once said he was incapable of loving anything but his own thoughts. He accused her of abandoning her maternal duties for fame and flattery. Their dynamic was a battlefield: pride versus independence, genius versus vanity, son versus mother. And in that battlefield, something deeper took root: resentment. For Schopenhauer, this wasn't just a difficult parent. It was the template through which he viewed all women. The woman who should have nurtured him became, in his mind, a symbol of deception, ego, and emotional coldness. And in the years that followed, he hardened this personal wound into philosophy. This wasn't mere bias. It was psychological armor. Rather than face the complexity of that pain, he transformed it into universal truth. He didn't see his mother as an individual. He saw her as proof of womanhood's failure. And so, his personal grief calcified into doctrine. To understand Schopenhauer's philosophy of women, you must first step into that fractured relationship. Because before he wrote On Women, before he crafted his metaphysics of contempt, he was a son, wounded, disillusioned, and unable to separate the mother he hated from the gender he condemned. Schopenhauer didn't just see women through a social or emotional lens. He embedded them into the very structure of his metaphysics. To him, women were not simply people. They were manifestations of the will, the blind, insatiable force he believed was the root of all human suffering. And because he saw the will as life's engine of torment, Anything tied to its continuation became suspect. In this equation, women became symbols, not of beauty or grace, but of bondage. They were the conduits through which life perpetuated itself, the agents of reproduction, the keepers of desire. In short, they were nature's trap. He believed that the female form, with its power to seduce and reproduce, was nature's bait, designed not for happiness, but for entrapment. Love, he claimed, was not a celebration of connection, but the will's clever disguise. The man who thought he was choosing a partner was, in fact, being manipulated by biology into furthering the cycle of pain. And the woman, in this system, became the lure, not by choice, but by design. To Schopenhauer, woman's identity was inseparable from her role in this eternal repetition. He didn't see her as a thinker, a builder, or a moral agent. He saw her as the embodiment of the very force he urged mankind to resist. The will to life, relentless, fertile, irrational, was, in his view, coded into her being. This wasn't hatred born from anger. It was rejection born from metaphysical despair. For Schopenhauer, to reject the will was to reject its symbols. And in his world, woman wasn't just a participant in the tragedy of life. She was its continuation. Not out of malice, but inevitability. And that inevitability, to him, made her the enemy of liberation, the guardian of the very prison he longed to escape. Schopenhauer didn't just hide his contempt behind philosophy. He cloaked it in the language of nature. He presented his views not as opinions, but as observations, as if the inferiority of women was simply a biological fact waiting to be acknowledged. He wrote with the authority of someone who believed he was revealing a hidden law of existence, not expressing personal prejudice. That made his words all the more dangerous. He claimed that women were governed entirely by instinct, incapable of rising above their natural impulses. To him, their intelligence was adaptive, not abstract, useful for manipulation, not creation. Their empathy, he believed, was rooted in self-preservation, not morality. Even their physical form, he argued, was nature's confession, smaller, softer, designed for seduction, not for strength or reason. And he used these claims to justify hierarchy. If women were bound by biology, if they were evolutionary instruments rather than moral agents, then there was no injustice in subjugating them. They weren't being oppressed. They were being returned to their natural place. In this logic, domination became a form of harmony, obedience, a return to order. But this wasn't science. It was philosophy dressed as anatomy, and it revealed something deeper than misogyny. It revealed fear. A fear of the uncontrollable, of the seductive power of life, of the feminine force that pulls men back into the cycle he was desperate to escape. By calling it nature, he made his fear look rational. Schopenhauer's brilliance wasn't in his cruelty. It was in how convincingly he framed it as truth. He didn't argue for oppression. He naturalized it. And in doing so, he didn't just insult women. He elevated his bias into cosmic law, sealing it behind the mask of objectivity where it could hide in plain sight. Schopenhauer's views didn't fade into obscurity. They ignited debate that still burns today. His essay on women became one of the most violently condemned pieces of his work, and yet it has also drawn strange admiration from certain corners of intellectual history. Some critics saw it as the angry rant of a lonely bachelor, a man whose failures in love curdled into philosophy. Others saw it as a mirror, distorted, yes, but uncomfortably honest. Feminist thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir later dissected his work with surgical clarity, exposing how his metaphysical framework reduced women to shadows in a world built for male anxiety. She saw in his writing the fear of the feminine, not its truth. For her, Schopenhauer was not describing women. He was describing his own limitations projected onto them. Nietzsche, despite his own controversial ideas, diverged from Schopenhauer's bitterness. While he adopted many of Schopenhauer's themes, suffering, power, transcendence, he viewed women with a kind of theatrical contradiction, both muse and mystery, manipulator and divine. He didn't echo Schopenhauer's contempt. He danced around it. In modern times, Schopenhauer's misogyny has been mined for meaning by psychologists, social theorists, and even internet provocateurs. Some treat his words as fuel for reactionary rebellion, quoting him to justify resentment. Others study him as a case of genius corrupted by personal wounds, a warning of what happens when intellect becomes a cage for emotional pain. The discomfort with Schopenhauer isn't just moral, it's philosophical. Can brilliance coexist with prejudice? Can we extract value from a mind that saw half the human race as lesser by nature? These are not just academic questions, they're moral reckonings. Because if Schopenhauer was wrong about women, what else was he wrong about? And if he was right about suffering, does that excuse the cruelty he wrapped around it? Schopenhauer's words cut deep, but they also expose something raw, something human. To dismiss his views as mere bitterness is easy, too easy. Because behind the cruelty lies a deeper question. What happens when intelligence turns against the world? When clarity breeds contempt instead of compassion? Schopenhauer's philosophy didn't arise from indifference. It was born from a mind that felt too much and trusted nothing. He saw beauty as deception, desire as slavery, and love as biology's sleight of hand. Women, in that context, became the face of everything he wanted to escape: attachment, reproduction, emotional entanglement. And so he didn't just critique them, he exiled them from the realm of dignity. But in doing so, he revealed not just his prejudice, but his fear of vulnerability. We don't study Schopenhauer's views to validate them. We study them to understand what happens when despair becomes doctrine. His contempt teaches us nothing about women, but everything about what happens when pain masquerades as truth, when philosophy becomes therapy with no healing. There is a danger in brilliance untempered by empathy, and Schopenhauer stands as its cautionary monument. His hatred did not make him right, it made him incomplete. And if we extract anything of value from his legacy, it must be this: that clarity without love becomes cruelty in disguise. The challenge isn't to erase thinkers like Schopenhauer. The challenge is to read them without surrendering to them, to hold their genius in one hand and their failure in the other. Because if we don't, we risk turning philosophy into dogma, and dogma into harm. Schopenhauer's shadow is vast, but so is our responsibility to walk through it with discernment, to see where he lost his way, and where perhaps we might find our own.